Hello and welcome to this lecture for the Chrysalis Diploma in Counselling Skills and Theory. This is for Component 6, Development, Motivation and Creativity. And this is Module 8, which focuses on anger and frustration. You can find the standards to be met by this particular component outlined in Moodle and in your written course materials. Today I will share some slides with you throughout this lecture, and you'll be able to download these from Moodle if you wish. Do please note any questions that you might have as you're watching this lecture, and take these to class to discuss with your class tutor. Okay, so we've got a quote at the beginning from Gandhi. So I've learned through bitter experience the one supreme lesson to conserve my anger. And as heat conserved is transmitted into energy, even so our anger controlled can be transmitted into a power that can move the world. And I really like this quote and it's included in the module, because we often think of anger as being a really negative emotion. In fact, we often think of anger as the behavior that goes with it, but actually anger in itself is an emotion. The way that we deal with our anger can be positive or negative, and often it's negative, and we often think of anger and aggression as the same thing, but as we're going to find out that they're not. Aggression is the behavior that might go with anger, the negative side of anger, but anger itself is an emotion, and we all feel anger. So what Gandhi is really saying is it's kind of what you do with that anger that matters. And actually, you can do positive things with it. It can be a real force for motivation and change. It can be a real power. So we're going to look first at frustration. And frustration, a feeling that we all have on a regular basis. And it's a feeling that we have when we're prevented from progressing or succeeding. Or from being fulfilled, and it can give rise to anger, obviously, but it can come from internal or external factors. So when we're talking about internal factors, we're talking about our own limitations. We're talking about dealing with the consequences of our own personal choices. And sometimes we can get very frustrated by ourselves. When we're thinking of external factors, that's on a real spectrum. So that could include anything from an annoying incident. Say, for example, having a puncture on your bike, which makes you late for work, and that can be really, really frustrating. Or to the other end, to the other extreme, to social injustice. And that can be, and some of these external forces or these external factors can actually be more frustrating in a way, because we feel that to some degree they're out of our control. But of course, the internal factors, although we can change them, they give us a real kind of a challenge, because changing ourselves is really difficult. So obviously, frustration can lead to anger, and we can feel anger when we're faced with lots and lots of different situations. And there's a real spectrum with anger, from that kind of mildly annoyed feeling to being in complete rage. So for example, we can feel anger when we feel afraid, when we're afraid. We can feel anger when we feel a lack of control over things. When we see or feel that an injustice is taking place. When we feel that any part of our life is being invaded. When we feel helpless or inadequate. When we feel that other people around us are exaggerating a situation out of all proportion, that can make us angry. And when we feel threatened. So there are different types of anger as well, and we're going to look at those on the following slide. Okay, looking at different categories of anger. So we have righteous anger, displaced anger, veiled anger, manipulative anger, and built up anger. And I'm sure as we go through them, you'll be able to think of many examples of these categories yourself. So if we start with righteous anger, and this is anger when a person is angry because they've been genuinely treated badly. So it might be a situation at work, for example, where you feel that you've been treated unfairly. That's just one example. There's lots of different examples, but in this case, actually, anger can be quite helpful because at the very least, it can help you to identify when something just isn't right. And it's often that it starts with that feeling that things just don't feel right here. And perhaps it can motivate you as well. If it's a situation that you have some sort of control over, it can motivate you to make a plan of action to actually alleviate that situation. So righteous anger doesn't feel very nice, but it actually can be a real motivational sort of anger. Displaced anger. And this can appear irrational because the anger is not really targeted where it truly belongs. So it may be difficult to understand, or it may seem extreme for a particular situation. So it's really helpful here to understand the true source of the anger. And an everyday kind of example of this is if you've had a really rough day, say you've had a really rough day at work, something's happened where with one of your colleagues or even with one of your bosses at work, where you felt real anger about something, but it would be really inappropriate to express that anger at work, particularly with your boss, for example. So you come home and you take that anger out on your partner at home, and that's something that we can probably all relate to at one time or another. And if we're the person whom that anger is being targeted at unfairly, it can feel really, it can be really confusing because you haven't done anything and yet someone's directing their anger to you. Next one is veiled anger. Anger can feel really strong and be expressed really strongly for those who have feelings of vulnerability or fear. It can really be acting as a shield for difficult emotions. And sometimes as a therapist, you will see people with anxiety, for example, and they're presenting with anger issues. It might feel easier for people to, I'm not suggesting it's a conscious choice either, but it just may sort of subconsciously feel easier to express anger than to express vulnerability, because when we express fear, for example, we do feel very vulnerable. And that's something you often see, those issues which are presented as anger management issues, and actually when you start getting down to the root of the problem, it's not really about anger at all. So manipulative anger, and this is where anger is more of a dramatic performance rather than a true feeling. And it might be that someone has learnt from other people or from situations in their past that actually you can use anger to control a situation. You can use anger to basically get what you want. So that's what manipulative anger is. It's not really a true feeling at all. And lastly, we've got built up anger, and often this sort of anger starts to build from childhood, where maybe you've been brought up in a family where it wasn't safe to express anger, or where anger wasn't acknowledged, or where anger was really seen as an unacceptable emotion. And here we really need to differentiate between anger as an emotion and any actions that go with anger, because anger is a completely natural human emotion. There's nothing positive or negative about anger, in the sense that it's just something that we all feel at some times. It's what you do with that anger that matters, and it's what you do with that anger that makes it positive or negative. So we're going to think about, before I go on to the next slide, and there's a lot of this in your notes, but it's not really covered by the slides in the PowerPoint. I just want to mention about the physiology of anger before we continue. Anger starts with the amygdala in our brain, and that part of our brain has a really, really crucial role in identifying threats so that we can protect ourselves. So the amygdala is a kind of a warning, it's like an early warning system, and it's a really early warning system. So what in fact happens is that the amygdala will identify a threat before the thinking bit of our brain, which is the cortex. So before the cortex really kind of kicks in. So we'll have this warning of a potential threat before we start thinking it through and being rational and making an assessment or a judgment on it. So, and actually in some scenarios that can be great, because some scenarios we don't have time to think about it. So if a car is speeding towards you and you're standing, you know, you're going to step off the pavement and suddenly that threat kicks in, you'll just step back. You won't have time to think, you'll just step back. So it can be a fantastic system when there is a genuine threat. However, there are some situations where that's not so great. So anger starts our fight or flight response, and we get to that aroused state of red alert quite quickly. Now, the thing is with anger, often we do calm down, and we can talk to our clients about ways to facilitate that calming down. But what we have to remember, and what's really important with this emotion, is that even if we start that process of calming down, physiologically, this actually takes time. So that quick reaction we had, it doesn't work in reverse. Our body takes time to calm down. And during that period of calming down, our threshold for getting angry again is lowered. So actually, we could reach that same state of anger again much more easily. And that's just worth remembering when we're talking about anger to people and we're talking about that calming down process. And there are obvious links to stress here, because if you're a very angry person and you get angry very easily, and some people are closer to that stage than others, a bit like stress, some people are closer to stress than others, they have a lower threshold. There is a link to stress, and there's a link as well. There's a relationship between people who get angry very, very easily and their physical well-being. So there's a link, for example, to chronic anger. There's a link to heart disease. So, you know, if we look back to that quote that Gandhi gave us at the beginning, yes, anger can have a positive side, but anger can also have a negative side. There are different elements to anger. And Parker Hall makes a distinction then between anger and rage. So anger there is sort of defined as an energy or a motivation, and it's linked to assertiveness and self-worth. Because if something makes you angry, if something's unfair, for example, and it makes you angry, you know, it's good to be assertive. It's good to have that healthy sense of, that's not fair. I've been treated badly here, and I'm allowed to do something about that. I'm allowed to say something about that. But rage, in this Parker Hall kind of model, rage is regarded as a precognitive experience, which is related to being in an environment where there was some sort of trauma, where an environment where our needs weren't met, and it's more linked to aggression, which we're going to look at on our next slide. So we've got definitions here of frustration, anger, and aggression, and I'm going to go through these. So frustration is an emotion, And just to kind of recap, it's when we're prevented from progressing or succeeding or being fulfilled. It might have internal or external factors or triggers, and it may well give rise to anger. Anger is an emotion when we feel afraid or when we feel out of control or we feel injustice and so on. It might be when we've got unresolved frustrations or injuries, and it can be a really powerful and motivating force for good and bad. It can be repressed or misdirected, but it actually is something that enhances our chances of survival or positive change, and it can really improve our environment if we use it as that motivating factor. But when we come to aggression, which, as I say, is linked to rage, aggression is a behavior. It's not an emotion, it's a behavior. It's something that we actually do. And aggression it's not necessarily physical, it can be verbal, but there is an intent to cause harm when we are aggressive. And of course we can direct that towards ourselves. It's not always externally directed. It's often a response to anger. It's often present from a young age. We might have learnt that from other people around us. It can be instrumental, hostile, or annoyance-led, and we'll look at those in a minute. But assertiveness should not be confused with aggression. And I think sometimes assertiveness and aggression can be confused a little bit, and people aren't always sure about how far they can go in terms of being assertive and where the balance is between assertiveness and aggression. But actually assertiveness is linked to a healthy sense of self-worth. It's linked to, that's not fair, I've got a right to say what I need to say, I've got a right to be listened to, whilst the whole intent of aggression is different. So there are different types, as I said. So instrumental aggression, for example, is reward-led. Hostile aggression, on the other hand, is revenge-led. So you're trying to actually, you're trying to gain revenge from somebody rather than trying to elicit a certain reward. And instrumental, annoyance-led. So instrumental was reward-led, hostile was revenge-led, and annoyance-led is when you're just being led by a desire to stop someone or something that's irritating you. Okay, so we're going to go on to look at some theories of aggression. And this is covered in your notes in a little bit more detail, but I'm just going to summarize them here for you. So we've got 3 different theories that we're looking at. Lorenz's ethological approach, Freud's psychoanalytical approach, and Bandura's social learning theory. So the first one we're going to look at is Lorenz's approach. And he proposed in 1963 that aggression in organisms, in different species, including human beings, was a result of an inherited tendency similar to other biogenic drives. So other biogenic drives like eating and drinking and so on. So in his view, aggression was really focused towards the survival of the species. It was a kind of instinctive thing that we have. And it's also exhibited, he found that it was also exhibited in different situations. So for example, animals that are in pain can exhibit aggression. Animals can exhibit aggression out of frustration. Animals can exhibit can exhibit aggression when they're hunting other animals, so in predatory situations, or in ritualistic situations, such as when animals are fighting to prove themselves as the kind of alpha of the pack, if we're thinking about animals. So that's a very much sort of instinctive sort of theory. So Freud's approach was that the goal of tension and excitation reduction is paramount, where the ideal state is one of complete elimination of tension. So where needs create a state of tension, and the elimination of tension happens when that need is met in some way. And he agreed with Lawrence, actually, that we mustn't ignore our aggression, but we need to put it to some good use, because if we don't put it to some good use, it will simply build up inside us, and then chances are it will be discharged in some more destructive way. So the last theory of aggression that's covered by this module is Bandura's theory of social learning, and this was from 1977. So this theory combines cognitive learning theory and behavioural learning theory. So in this theory, we see aggression as being associated with learned behaviour and imitating the aggressive behaviours of others. Particularly if we perceive that behaviour is somehow rewarding. Because if we get a reward from that behaviour, it reinforces it. And he's used his study of Bobo dolls, which is mentioned again in your notes, has been cited to support this. And he said that what this demonstrated was that children who'd been exposed to violence will show more aggression than children who haven't. And actually, this type of social learning theory has been used when people argue, for example, that children shouldn't watch violence on TV, or violence on TV negatively impacts their own presentation of aggression. Also, when there's debates about video games and violence in video games. But it's a bit of a controversial debate, because although some studies, for example, Bandura's study of the Bobo dolls, he shows some evidential research and evidential support for his theory. There have also been other studies which refute that evidence and refute this type of theory. So it's a bit of a controversial one. Okay, so we're going to look at Signs of Anger from Madlow in 1972. So he actually identified some behavioural and cognitive responses that indicate anger. And I'm going to read them all through quickly, but then I'm going to look at them in a bit more detail. So direct behaviour, direct verbal and indirect behaviour, indirect verbal, thinly veiled verbal, and thinly veiled behaviour. So all of these are signs of anger. So I'm going to give you some examples of these. So direct behaviour, for example. So we're talking here of when we're talking here of assault, maybe physical and verbal cruelty. We always think of assault as physical, but of course it can be verbal as well. So aggressive verbalization, so shouting at people, being overly critical, name calling, prejudice as well, hurtful and malicious verbalizations, troublemaking, and also rebellious and antisocial behavior and open defiance. So when we're looking at direct verbal signs or cognitive signs, we're thinking about open hatred and insult. So I hate your guts, contempt and disgust, being really critical to somebody, being suspicious or blaming, being revengeful, name calling. All of those quite obvious, really, signs of anger. So thinly veiled behavioural signs. Distrustful behaviour, sceptical behaviour, argumentative or indirectly challenging, being resentful or envious, being disruptive, being passively resistant. When we think of these thinly veiled behavioural signs and verbal signs, which we'll go on to, we're thinking of kind of passive aggressive here. So someone who's a bit sarcastic or cynical or judgmental, and similar with thinly behaved verbalizations, when people say, well, they're not my kind of people, or I'm not angry, I'm disappointed, which is, it's always actually really difficult to take that. It's almost more difficult to take that disappointed quote that some of us might remember from our childhood. Indirect behavioural signs, so being withdrawn, some psychosomatic disorders, depression, guilt, some serious mental illness as well, like paranoid schizophrenia. Somebody who's excessively submissive or deferential. And indirect verbal signs, I just don't want to talk about it. I'm just disappointed in our relationship. Why does this always happen to me? So all of those signs of anger, from the direct ones, the more direct ones which are obvious, like actually physically or verbally assaulting people, to those thinly veiled ones which are more on the passive aggressive sort of side. All of those are signs of anger, and it's useful to have a really good look at those in your notes and to learn those responses, as they are a really good indication of clients' issues that may be related to some anger-inducing situations in their past or present, or feelings of anger that they found it difficult to work through, or they've not even been able to recognise. Because if somebody's presenting with very passive-aggressive behaviour, for example, and you were to suggest that there was some anger there, they might not even be consciously aware of it. But it's good for you as a therapist to be able to recognise some of those signs. Okay, so we're going to go on to looking at some ego defence mechanisms which are intended to hide our anger. So we'll start with displacement. We mentioned this earlier. So shifting our anger from their actual true target to a substitute target. And I mean, that's obviously negative in several ways, because it's going to cause issues with the person that you're substituting. So if you have had that really, if you have had that really annoying situation with a colleague at work, and you don't want to rock the boat at work because you think it will be awkward at work, so you come home and shout at your partner, maybe this will happen once or twice and everyone will get over it. But if this happens on a very regular basis, obviously it's not only going to give you a lot of stress at work, because you're actually trying to sort of suppress or repress, you're trying to repress your anger at work, but it's also going to give you possible relationship problems. But over and above as well, you never actually address the root cause of your anger. You never actually get to the bottom of it. And maybe this is where a bit of assertiveness training comes in, because if you really felt that this was an ongoing situation with a colleague, and it's an issue where, a communication issue, or an issue where you felt things were unfair, really you're only ever going to sort this out if you can be assertive and address the actual situation. So going on to indirect expression, where we're really angry about one thing, but actually we express that anger onto something else. And this can happen when, you might be angry about something that it's really, really difficult to talk about for whatever reason. It's just, you're just finding it really, really hard to address that particular issue. But the problem is with anger, it's really, you know, unless we actually address the root of it, it's actually one of those emotions that can just build up. So it has to have some discharge somewhere. And if it doesn't have the positive discharge where it motivates us to do something about our situation, or to address that issue, or to have some open and honest communication, or to improve things at work or whatever, it tends to come out in other ways. It tends to come out at other targets, as in displacement, or it tends to be expressed to maybe the right person or in a different situation. So you might be very angry, for example, about the fact that your partner's had an affair with somebody, and you've decided to carry on. You've not really expressed the true depth of your emotions. So actually, you start to get angry about other smaller things in the relationship that are easier to talk about. You know, like who's doing the most housework, or, you know, things that are quite trivial compared to the big issue, the kind of elephant in the room. And really it's not a healthy way to be. So looking at denial as well, and denial can just lead to sort of really internal conflicts, which leads you to anxiety. Again, you know, it's that inability to really cope with that situation. So it's easier to deny that that's going on. Suppression, and this is a way of reducing immediate risk, and might be a behaviour that we learn from others. We might have learned from others that anger is not acceptable. Anger is not an acceptable emotion. But again, pushing that anger down and not being able to express it in any way can lead to real physical and mental consequences. As we know, stress, it will stress us out, and stress can lead to conditions such as heart disease and so on. Okay, so we're going to learn some ways of using a CBT approach in working with anger with our clients. And when we do this, it's really useful. It's useful, as I said earlier, to recognize those signs of anger, particularly looking for those veiled, indirect signs of anger. But it's also useful to remember that anger can have its roots in the past. So someone might be very angry now, but really the root of that might be nothing to do with their present situation. That might be something to do with something that happened quite a long time ago. Anger might be linked to frustrations as well. It can be linked to clients feeling that they are unable to act or unable to change things. And that might be to do with a lack of assertiveness, which, you know, going further back and exploring that might be to do with a lack of self-worth, for example. But it's also useful to remember that anger can kind of arise from very, very serious situations as well. So there may be some really unresolved anger from very serious situations in a client's past. So for example, like sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, all these kind of traumatic situations, which obviously in year two, you are limited in year two by your experience. And there may be other serious situations as well where clients have developed very negative self-defeating behaviours such as alcoholism, self-harming and eating disorders. And again, these are beyond the scope of year two students. And it's important, obviously, that you always work within your sphere of experience and knowledge. So using a CBT approach in working with anger. So you know a little bit about CBT by this stage. So CBT is is designed to help clients and volunteers to identify automatic negative thoughts and ultimately to change these by a process of challenging those thoughts and so on. So there's two situations here. There's a situation that somebody who has anger problems, the first situation that we have is the way that they might react currently. So, for example, so someone pushes in front of you for that last car parking space. We've all had that. It's an annoying situation. So one of the ways that you can react to that is by thinking, how dare they? I'm not going to let them get away with that. They did that on purpose. This is always happening to me. And obviously you're going to feel, if that's your automatic thought, that this is always happening to me, and I'm not going to let them get away with that, you're going to have that sense of anger, a sense of righteousness. You're going to be feeling humiliated, perhaps. It's going to be one more humiliation to add on to other humiliations from the past. And the behaviour that may arise from that, the aggressive behaviour may be that you confront that person, you cause a fight. There's a lot of physical and verbal aggression going on here, security accord, and you end up having to give your details to the police. And it's just that negative spiralling that can happen. But as a therapist, you can unpick that situation and you can think about, well, let's have a look at where those thoughts and feelings and actions, where they're all linking. Because actually, if you looked at the exact situation in a different way, the following could happen. So exact same situation where somebody pushes in front of you for that last car parking space. And, quite reasonably, you could think, well, that was rude. They're clearly in a hurry. And, I might point out their rudeness, but I just need to find another spot. There's other spots. It's not the end of the world. So, it's very reasonable to suggest you might be slightly annoyed by this situation, but calm. And you can calmly and assertively inform them that you were ready to move into that spot. And they can take the lead on that. So they might say, oh, okay, fair enough, and I'll move out. They might not, but that doesn't need to make a difference to you. You can be calm about it. You've been assertive. You feel good about that, but you can then graciously move on with your day rather than letting that anger impact on you. Because that's the problem with negative anger. The person who's stolen your car parking space probably won't bother them, or it may not bother them that you're very angry. But if you're the sort of person who holds on to that anger, it's going to ruin your day. It's not going to ruin their day, it's going to ruin your day. So let's have a look at some strategies that might be useful for a client when using this type of approach. Okay, so helping your client to learn to walk away and distance themselves if feelings get out of control. Helping your clients to take a deep breath and count to 10 before responding. Or modeling as well and teaching your clients some good breathing techniques, like belly breathing, for example, which, if done properly, will automatically lead you to physically calming down. So, when you do CBT with people, you can look at lots of strategies that can help them in the moment, because even if you're encouraging that thought challenging, there will be situations where they will still get angry. So teaching them those strategies to use in the moment. So learning methods of relaxation. So it might be progressive muscle relaxation, for example. There might be elements of mindfulness. Encouraging them to seek to try out different forms of relaxation so that their anger threshold is lower and they won't be so quick to get into those negative situations. Encouraging them to ask themselves, why am I angry? And encouraging them to do that thought challenging, where they're stopping, pausing, being rational. So they're allowing the cortex to catch up with the amygdala once they stop and pause and get into the habit of doing that, so that they can assess the situation in a more rational way and assess the choices that they have in a situation. One of the choices is, yes, they could hit somebody. Is that the most rational choice? Another choice is they could talk calmly to somebody. Another choice is they could simply walk away. So, you know, asking them to have that stop, that pause, so that they can start thinking about things rationally. And it's good to share, by the way, the physiology of anger there, so that they can actually see a reason why you're asking them to do that. So they can, you know, so you talk to them a little bit about the amygdala and the cortex and the anger response, so they actually understand why you're asking them to do that. Ask them about the relevance of their anger. Ask them about what actually are they hoping to achieve by this anger. Because in the previous example, actually, what they achieved was not actually what they ended up getting. And that often happens when we allow our anger to spiral in negative ways. We don't even think about what the purpose is, and we never get something good out of it. Encouraging them to do some exercise, which we know is a fantastic stress relief. Doing the recycling. If you've ever recycled bottles, that is a great form of anger relief. But also, some sports can be a fantastic way of directing your anger as well, and directing any aggression that you feel into something more positive. Start and maintain an anger diary. Thought diaries, anger diaries, these are kind of at the heart of CBT approaches, because if we're going to help ourselves, we need to know our own triggers. And that's what this is about. So if someone does a diary, they can find out what their particular triggers are. They can find out as well, are they quicker to anger at certain times of the day when they're perhaps tired? Or so you can put lots of things in that diary and really talk it through together and kind of unpick all of those situations. Look at assertiveness training methods. As we said earlier, sometimes people mistake anger for aggression, and they'll say, oh yeah, I'm really assertive. Well, you're not really assertive, you're really aggressive. And actually aggression doesn't get what you want, whereas assertiveness is more focused at actually being able to get what you want, not in a negative manipulative way, but being able to get what is your due, being able to say what you mean, being able to or expecting other people to listen as is your right. And looking for ways to forgive people. So we're going to look at Parker Hall's relational approach to working with clients on anger issues. And by relational approach, we mean the following. So using the core conditions, empathy, unconditional positive regard, and so on. Staying client-centered, creating a supportive space, helping clients to understand their anger as a healthy emotion, as a force for good, helping clients to understand their anger as motivational and protecting, helping clients to understand the true target of their anger, helping clients to understand how their anger supports self-esteem and boundaries, and distinguishing anger from rage. So the sorts of conversations and the sorts of discussions today in this PowerPoint are the sorts of discussions that you can have with clients. explaining how the physiology works, explaining some of the ways that they may have displaced their anger, looking at the purpose of their anger, looking at really what they want to get out of things, talking about their self-worth, looking at how assertive they are. All of those factors are really, really useful in helping clients. Now, if you have someone who is prone to anger, that is, at the moment, their kind of go-to, their sort of go-to response when they feel frustrated by other people or by themselves, it may be that sometimes you will experience some anger in the therapy room. And there are some ways that you can prepare for this. So firstly, you need to be staying calm yourself and reducing eye contact. Obviously, as therapists, we have good eye contact with our clients and our volunteers, but sometimes in an angry situation, eye contact can feel a little bit like a challenge to people, and it can exacerbate the situation. So don't completely look away, but reduce that eye contact a little bit. If someone is having a little bit of an angry rant, obviously listen to them, but it is not the time to start analysing, what they're saying, analysing their feelings. That will not go down well, and it will just increase the anger response that they're giving you. On the other hand, don't be afraid to speak. Don't sit there and feel kind of cowed by their anger. Don't take it personally, and this is really important because, as we've learned today, anger is often completely misdirected. And if they're talking to you about all of those situations where they felt anger, but they've not been able to address the situation in a positive way, remember that anger's there. And in some ways, they're taking it out on you and discharging their anger with you because you provided that safe space. It doesn't feel great in the moment, but then don't feel they can do that with other people. So don't take it personally. It's very unlikely to be personal. And you might be able to pull back from this anger situation. However, your safety is absolutely paramount here. So if you feel threatened, end that session. Don't try and work through it if that anger is just kind of on the increase and you feel really under threat. And obviously take the issue to supervision. If you're working in placement, your placement supervision is the place to take it. If you're, and I know your year twos, but I know some year twos might have started their placement a little bit early. If you're working with volunteers, talk to your tutor about it. But all the time, the overriding, the overriding thing for you really is to stay as calm as you possibly can, relaxed body language. People pick up on that tension. Working within your limits is really, really important. And for the most part, working within your limits will prevent things like this happening. But also, if you do start in your placement a little bit early, I mean, we're on module 10, so some of you might have done, just take some time at the beginning to check all the security arrangements in your placement so that you feel absolutely safe. You know who to call on and you know what to do. It's really important. And some of you will be seeing volunteers in their homes or in your homes. Always make sure you feel safe, because therapy isn't just about your clients, it's about you too, and your safety is really, really important. So we're going to go on to our last slide now, and this is about forgiveness, and this is taken from the work of Casanova and Taffrate from 2007. So Forgiveness is all about the release of resentment and negative feelings, and replacing those negative feelings with positive feelings if possible, but neutral feelings. It's about acceptance, and it's about you. It's not about the person who wronged you. So it's not the same as forgetting. It can be quite a controversial subject, forgiveness, because people will often say, well, I don't want to forget that. I don't feel there's any justification or excuse for their action. It's not about that in this context, at least. So it's not the same as forgetting. There's no onus on you to necessarily justify somebody else's bad behaviour. There's no onus on you to excuse somebody's bad behaviour, but it's about you feeling better. Because the problem is, when we keep that anger and resentment towards somebody else inside of us, it doesn't hurt them. They don't care. They don't even know. It kind of eats away at us. So forgiveness in this context is about replacing that horrible resentment that builds up and overspills into other areas of our life, replacing that with neutrality, with a kind of acceptance. Yes, that happened, but I can move on. So Casanova and Taffrate looked at a process by which this can be assisted in therapy. And this process involved 5 stages. So the first stage is you, as a therapist, you establish a safe environment for that client or volunteer to express their feelings openly. If there's a lot of anger and resentment and it's being suppressed for whatever reason, that anger and resentment is still going to be there. So if you establish that safe environment, it can be expressed within that environment. So the next stage is allowing those feelings to emerge. And, you know, by giving those core conditions, by being non-judgmental, by being empathic, by showing that compassionate understanding, by actively listening to the client's story, and by doing that, you're showing the client that you're interested in what they've got to say. You know, this is something that is important to them, so it's important to you. And stage 4, this process, this relationship, is enabling new feelings such as dignity and determination, and that sense of that burgeoning sense of self-worth and self-esteem and self-value. And at the end of this process, the client may be ready to forgive, and they may even feel some empathy for their perpetrator. They may be able to reach a positive acceptance. They may have replaced that negative feeling with positivity, but it may be just now it doesn't affect them anymore. And that's where you want to get to, that it doesn't affect them anymore. They can let that go, and they're free from that situation or that feeling. So we've come to the end of our whistle-stop tour through anger and frustration and rage today. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's quite an interesting topic, because anger isn't just about anger. It can be about a whole myriad of other emotions and other situations as well. Read your module notes. They will have a little bit more information than I've been able to give you today, although I think I've covered most of what's in the notes. It might be a good idea to just jot down some questions as well for when you see your tutor next online for the online classes. And I'm just going to stop the share, and thank you for watching. Bye bye.